don't know the answer. It gives me a headache just trying to think down to your level. Trillian burst in through the door from her cabin. My white mice have escaped, she said. An expression of deep worry and concern failed to cross either of Zaphod's faces. Nuts to your white mice, he said. Trillian glared an upset glare at him and disappeared again. Is it possible that her remark would have commanded greater attention had it been generally realized that human beings were only the third most intelligent life form present on the planet Earth, instead of, as was generally thought by most independent observers, the second? Good afternoon, boys. The voice was oddly familiar but oddly different. It had a matriarchal twang. It announced itself to the crew as they arrived at the airlock hatchway that would let them out on the planet's surface. They looked at each other in puzzlement. It's a computer, explained Zaphod. I discovered it had an emergency backup personality that I thought might work out better. Now, this is going to be your first day out on a strange new planet, continued Eddie's new voice. So I want you all wrapped up snug and warm, and no playing with any naughty bug-eyed monsters. As Zaphod tapped impatiently on the hatch. I'm sorry, he said. I think we might be better off with a slide rule. Right, snapped the computer. Who said that? Will you open up the exit hatch, please, computer? Said Zaphod, trying not to get angry. Not until whoever said that owns up, urged the computer, stamping a few synapses closed. Oh, God, muttered Ford, slumped against a bulkhead. He started to count to 10. He was desperately worried that one day sentient life forms would forget how to do this. Only by counting could humans demonstrate their independence of computers. Come on, said Eddie sternly. Computer, began Zaphod. I'm waiting, interrupted Eddie. I can wait all day if necessary. Computer, said Zaphod again, who had been trying to think of some subtle piece of reasoning to put the computer down with, and had decided not to bother competing with it on its own ground. If you don't open that exit hatch this moment, I will zap straight off to your major databanks and reprogram you with a very large axe. Got that? Eddie, shocked, paused and considered this. Ford carried on counting quietly. This is about the most aggressive thing you can do to a computer, equivalent of going up to a human being and saying, blood, 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 blood. I kind of want to do that now. Finally, Eddie said quietly, I can see this relationship is something we're all going to have to work at. And the hatchway opened. An icy wind ripped into them. They hugged themselves warmly and stepped down the ramp onto the barren dust of Magrathea. It'll all end in tears. I know it, shouted Eddie after them, and then closed the hatchway again. A few minutes later, he opened and closed the hatchway again in response to a command that caught him entirely by surprise. Chapter 20. 5 figures wandered slowly over the blighted land. Bits of it were dullish gray, bits of it dullish brown, and the rest of it rather less interesting to look at. It was like a dried-out marsh, now barren of all vegetation and covered with a layer of dust about an inch thick. It was very cold. Zaphod was clearly rather depressed about it. He stalked off by himself and was soon lost to sight behind a slight rise in the ground. The wind stung Arthur's eyes and ears, and the stale, thin air clasped his throat. However, the thing that was stung most was his mind. It's fantastic, he said, and his own voice rattled his ears. sound carried badly in this thin atmosphere. Desolate hole, if you ask me, said Ford. I could have more fun in a cat litter. He felt a mounting irritation of all planets in all the star systems of all the galaxy, many wild and exotic, seething with life. Didn't he just have to turn up at a dump like this? After 15 years of being cast away, not even a hot dog stand in evidence. He stooped down and picked up a cold clod of earth, but there was nothing underneath it worth crossing thousands of light years to look at. No, insisted Arthur. Don't you understand? This is the first time I've actually stood on the surface of another planet. A whole alien world. Pity it's such a dump, though. Trillian hugged herself, shivered and frowned. She could have sworn she saw a slight and unexpected movement out of the corner of her eye. But when she glanced in that direction, all she could see was the ship, still and silent, 100 yards or so behind them. She was relieved when a second or so later they caught sight of Zaphod standing on top of the ridge of ground and waving to them to come and join him. He seemed to be excited, but they couldn't clearly hear what he was saying because of the thinnish atmosphere and the wind. As they approached the ridge of higher ground, they became aware that it seemed to be circular, a crater about 150 yards wide. Round the outside of the crater, the sloping ground was spattered with black and red lumps. They stopped and looked at a piece. It was wet. It was rubbery. With horror, they suddenly realized that it was fresh whale meat. At the top of its crater's lip, they met Zaphod. Look, he said, pointing into the crater. In the center lay the exploded carcass of a lonely sperm whale that hadn't lived long enough to be disappointed with its lot. The silence was only disturbed with the slight involuntary spasms of Trillian's throat. I suppose there's no point in trying to bury it, murmured Arthur, and then wished he hadn't. Come, said Zaphod, and started back down the crater. What, down there? Said Trillian with severe distaste. Yeah, said Zaphod. Come on, I've got something to show you. We can see it, said Trillian. Not that, said Zaphod. Something else. Come on. They all hesitated. Come on, insisted Zaphod. I found a way in. In? Said Arthur in horror. Into the interior of the planet? An underground passage? The force of the whale's impact cracked it open, and that's where we have to go? Where no man has trod these 5 million years into the very depths of time itself? Marvin started his ironical humming again. Zaphod hit him and he shut up. With little shudders of disgust, they all followed Zaphod down the incline into the crater, trying very hard to avoid looking at its unfortunate creator. Life, said Marvin dolefully. Loathe it or ignore it. You can't like it. The ground had caved in where the whale had hit it, revealing a network of galleries and passages, now largely obstructed by collapsed rubble and entrails. Zaphod had made us start clearing a way into one of them, but Marvin was able to do it rather faster. Dank air wafted out of its dark recesses, and as Zaphod shone a flashlight into it, little was visible in the dusty gloom. According to the legends, he said, the Magrathians lived most of their lives underground. Why's that? Said Arthur. Did the surface become too polluted or overpopulated? No, I don't think so, said Zaphod. I think they just didn't like it very much. Are you sure you know what you're doing? Said Trillian, peering nervously into the darkness. They've been attacked once already, you know. Look, kid, I promise you the live population of this planet is nil plus the 4 of us. So, come on. Let's get on in there. Hey, Earthman, Arthur, said Arthur. Yeah, could you just sort of keep this robot with you and guard this end of the passageway, okay? Guard? Said Arthur. What from? You just said there's no one here. Yeah, well, just for safety, okay? Said Zaphod. Whose? Yours or mine? Good lad. Okay, here we go. Zaphod scrambled down into the passage, followed by Trillian and Ford. Well, I hope you all have a really miserable time, complained Arthur. Don't worry, Marvin assured him. They will. Oh, I need a Marvin in my life. In a few seconds, they had disappeared from view. Arthur stamped around in a huff and then decided that a whale's graveyard is not, on the whole, a good place to stamp around in. Marvin eyed him balefully for a moment and then turned himself off. Zaphod marched quickly down the passageway, nervous as hell, but trying to hide it by striding purposefully. He flung the beam around. The walls were covered in dark tiles and were cold to the touch. The air thick with decay. There, what did I tell you? He said, an inhabited planet, Magrathea. He strode on through the dirt and debris that littered the tile floors. Trillian was reminded, unavoidably, of the London Underground, though it was less thoroughly squalid. At intervals along the walls, the tiles gave way to large mosaics, simple angular patterns, and bright colors. Trillian stopped and studied one of them, but could not interpret any sense in them. She called to Zaphod. Hey, have you any idea what these strange symbols are? I think they're just strange symbols of some kind, said Zaphod, hardly glancing back. Trillian shrugged and hurried after him. From time to time, a doorway led either to the left or right into smallish chambers which Ford discovered to be full of derelict computer equipment. He dragged Zaphod into one to have a look. Trillian followed. Look, said Ford. You reckon this is Magrathea? Yeah, said Zaphod. And we heard the voice right? Okay, so I bought the fact that it's Magrathea for the moment. What you have so far said nothing about is how in the galaxy you found it. You didn't just look it up in a star atlas, that's for sure. Research, government archives, detective work, few lucky guesses, easy. And then you stole the heart of gold to come and look for it with. I stole it to look for a lot of things. A lot of things, said Ford in surprise. Like what? I don't know. What? I don't know what I'm looking for. Why not? Because I think it might be because if I knew, I wouldn't be able to look for them. What, are you crazy? It's a possibility I haven't ruled out yet, said Zaphod quietly. I only know as much about myself as my mind can work out under its current conditions, and its current conditions are not good. And for a long time, nobody said anything as Ford gazed at Zaphod with a mind suddenly full of worry. Listen, old friend, if you want to, started Ford eventually. No, wait. I'll tell you something, said Zaphod. I freewheel a lot. I get an idea to do something, and hey, why not? I do it. I reckon I'll become president of the galaxy, and it just happens. It's easy. I decide to steal the ship. I decide to look for Magrathea, and it all just happens. Yeah, I work out how it can best be done, right, but it always works out. It's like having a galactic credit card, which keeps on working, though you never send off the checks. And then whenever I stop and think, why did I want to do something? How did I work out how to do it? I get a very strong desire to just stop thinking about it. Like I have now. It's a big effort to talk about. Zaphod paused for a while. For a while there was silence. And then he frowned and said, Last night I was worrying about this again, about the fact that part of my mind just didn't seem to work out properly. Then it occurred to me that the way it seemed was that someone else was using my mind to have good ideas with, without telling me about it. I put the two ideas together and decided that maybe that somebody had locked off part of my mind for that purpose, which was why I couldn't use it. I wondered if there was a way I could check. I went to the ship's medical bay and plugged myself into the encephalographic screen. I went through every major screening test on both my heads. All the tests I had to go through under government medical officers before my nomination for presidency could be properly ratified. They showed up nothing unexpected at least. They showed up that I was clever, imaginative, irresponsible, untrustworthy, extrovert, nothing you could have guessed, or you couldn't have guessed, and no other anomalies. So I started inventing further tests completely at random, nothing. Then I tried superimposing the results from one head on top of the results from the other head. Still nothing. Finally, I got silly because I'd given it all up as nothing more than an attack of paranoia. Last thing I did before I packed it in was take the superimposed picture and look at it through a green filter. You remember I was always superstitious about the color green when I was a kid. I always wanted to be a pilot on one of the trading scouts. Ford nodded. And there it was, said Zaphod, clear as day, a whole section in the middle of both brains that related only to each other and not to anything else around them. Some bastard had cauterized all the synapses and electronically traumatized those two lumps of cerebellum. Ford stared at him aghast. Trillian had turned white. Somebody did that to you? Whispered Ford. Yeah. But have you any idea who or why? Why? I can only guess, but I do know who the bastard was. Do you know? How do you know? Because they left their initials burned into the cauterized synapses. They left them there for me to see them. Ford stared at him in horror and felt his skin begin to crawl. Initials burned into your brain? Yeah. Well, what were they for? Or what were they, for God's sake? Zaphod looked at him in silence again for a moment, and then he looked away. ZB. Oh, God, he said quietly. At that moment, a steel shutter slammed down behind them, and gas started to pour into the chamber. I'll tell you about it later, choked Zaphod, as all three passed out. Chapter 21. On the surface of Magrathea, Arthur wandered about moodily. Ford had thoughtfully left him his copy of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy while away the time with. Okay. He pushed a few buttons at random. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a very unevenly edited book and contains many passages that simply seemed to its editors like a good idea at the time. One of these, the one Arthur now came across, supposedly relates to the experiences of one Beat Wujagi. I don't know. It's an alien. A quiet young student at the University of Maximilian, who pursued a brilliant academic career studying ancient philology, transformational ethics, and the wave of harmonic theory of historical perception, and then after a night of drinking pan-galactic gargle blasters with Zaphod Beeblebrox, became increasingly obsessed with the problem of what had happened to all the ballpoints he'd bought over the past few years. There followed a long period of painstaking research during which he visited all the major centers of ballpoint laws throughout the galaxy, and eventually came up with a quaint little theory that quite caught the public imagination at the time. Somewhere in the cosmos, he said, along with all the planets inhabited by humanoids, reptiloids, fishoids, walking treeoids, and superintelligent shades of the color blue, there was also a planet entirely given over to ballpoint life forms. And it was to this planet that unattended ballpoints would make their way, slipping away quietly through wormholes in space to a world where they knew they could enjoy a uniquely ballpointoid lifestyle, responding to highly ballpoint-oriented stimuli and generally leading the ballpoint equivalent of the good life. And as theories go, this was all very fine and pleasant until Bujagig suddenly claimed to have found this planet and to have worked there for a while, driving a limousine for a family of cheap green retractables, whereupon he was taken away, locked up. He wrote a book and was finally sent into tax exile, which is the usual fate reserved for those who are determined to make fools of themselves in public. And when one day an expedition was sent to the spatial coordinates of that Vujagig had claimed for this planet, they discovered only a small asteroid inhabited by a solitary old man who claimed repeatedly that nothing was true, though he was later discovered to be lying. There did, however, remain the question of both the mystery 60,000 Altarian dollars paid yearly into his Brandisbogen bank account, and of course Zaphod Beeblebrox's highly profitable second-hand ballpoint business. Arthur read this and put the book down. The robot still sat there, completely inert. Arthur got up and walked to the top of the crater. He walked around the crater and watched two suns set magnificently over Magrathea. He went back into the crater. He woke the robot up, because even a manically depressed robot is better to talk to than nobody. Night's falling, he said. Look, robot, the stars are coming out. From the heart of the dark nebula, it is possible to see very few stars, and only very faintly, but they were there to be seen. The robot obediently looked at them, then looked back. I know, he said. Wretched, isn't it? But that sunset, I've never seen anything like it. In my wildest dreams, the two suns, it was like mountains of fire boiling into space. I've seen it, said Marvin. It's rubbish. We only ever had the one sun at home, persevered Arthur. I came from a planet called Earth, you know. I know, said Marvin. You keep going on about it. It sounds awful. Oh, no, it was a beautiful place. Did it have oceans? Oh, yes, said Arthur with a sigh. Great, wide, rolling blue oceans. I can't bear oceans, said Marvin. Tell me, inquired Arthur, do you get on well with other robots? Hate them, said Marvin. Where are you going? Arthur couldn't bear anymore. He had got up again. I think I'll just take another walk, he said. Don't blame you, said Marvin, and counted 597 billion sheep before falling asleep again a second later. Arthur slapped his arms about himself to try and get his circulation a little more enthusiastic about its job. He trudged back up the wall of the crater, because the atmosphere was so thin, and because there was no moon. Nightfall was very rapid, and it was by now very dark. Because of this, Arthur practically walked into the old man before he noticed him. Chapter 22. He was standing with his back to Arthur, watching the very last glimmers of light sink into blackness behind the horizon. He was tallish, elderly, and dressed in a single long gray robe. When he turned, his face was thin and distinguished, careworn, but not unkind. The sort of face you would happily bank with. But he didn't turn yet, not even to react to Arthur's yelp of surprise. Eventually, the last rays of the sun vanished completely, and he turned. His face was still illuminated from somewhere, and when Arthur looked for the source of light, he saw that a few yards away stood a small craft of some kind, a small hovercraft, Arthur guessed. It shed a dim pool of light around it. The man looked at Arthur sadly, it seemed. "You choose a cold night to visit our dead planet," he said. Who are you?" stammered Arthur. The man looked away. Again, a look of sadness seemed to cross his face. "My name is not important," he said. He seemed to have something on his mind. Conversation was clearly something he felt he didn't have to rush at. Arthur felt awkward. You startled me," he said lamely. The man looked around to him again and slightly raised his eyebrows. "Hmm?" he said. "I said you startled me." "Well, do not be alarmed. I will not harm you." Arthur frowned at him. "But you shot at us. There were missiles," he said. The man gazed into the pit of the crater. The slight glow from Marvin's eyes cast very faint red shadows on the huge carcass of the whale. The man chuckled slightly. "An automatic system," he said, and gave a small sigh. "Ancient computers ranged in the bowels of the planet tick away the dark millennia, and the ages hang heavy on their dusty databanks. I think they take the occasional pot shot to relieve the monotony." He looked gravely at Arthur and said, "I'm a great fan of science, you know." "Oh, really?" said Arthur, who was beginning to find the man's curiously kindly manner disconcerting. "Oh, yes," said the old man, and simply stopped talking again. "Ah," said Arthur. He had an odd feeling of being like a man in the act of adultery, who is surprised when the woman's husband wanders into the room, changes his trousers, passes a few idle remarks about the weather, and leaves again. "You seem ill at ease," said the old man with polite concern. No, well, yes, actually, you see, we weren't really expecting to find anybody about, in fact. I sort of gathered that you were all dead or something." "Dead?" said the old man. "Good gracious me, no. We have slept." "Slept?" said Arthur incredulously. "Yes, through the economic recession, you see," said the old man, apparently unconcerned about whether Arthur understood a word he was talking about or not. Arthur had to prompt him again. Economic recession? Well, you see, 5 million years ago, the galactic economy collapsed, and seeing that custom-built planets are something of a luxury commodity, you see." He paused and looked at Arthur. "You know we built planets, do you?" he asked solemnly. "Well, yes," said Arthur. "I'd sort of gathered." "Fascinating trade," said the old man, and a wistful look came into his eyes. "Doing the coastlines was always my favorite. We used to have endless fun doing the little bits of fjords. So, anyway," he said, trying to find his thread again, "the recession came and we decided it would save a lot of bother if we just slept through it. So we programmed the computers to revive us when it was all over." The man stifled a very slight yawn and continued. "The computers were index linked to the galactic stock market prices, you see, so that we'd all be revived when everybody else had rebuilt the economy enough to afford our rather expensive services." Arthur, a regular Guardian reader, was deeply shocked at this. "That's a pretty unpleasant way to behave, isn't it?" "Is it?" asked the old man mildly. "I'm sorry, I'm a bit out of touch." He pointed down into the crater. "Is that robot yours?" he said. "No," came a thin metallic voice from the crater. "I'm mine." "If you'd call it a robot," muttered Arthur. "It's more a sort of electronic sulking machine." "Bring it," said the old man. Arthur was quite surprised to hear a note of decision suddenly present in the old man's voice. He called to Marvin, who crawled up the slope, making a big show of being lame, which he wasn't. "On second thoughts," said the old man, "leave it here. You must come with me. Great things are afoot." He turned toward his craft, which, though no apparent signal had been given, now drifted quietly toward them through the dark. Arthur looked down at Marvin, who now made an equally big show of turning around laboriously and trudging off down into the crater again, muttering sour nothings to himself. "Come," called the old man. "Come now, or you will be late." "Late?" said Arthur. "What for? What is your name, human?" "Dent, Arthur Dent," said Arthur. "Late as in the late Dent Arthur Dent," said the old man sternly. It's a sort of threat, you see. Another wistful look came into his tired old eyes. "I've never been very good at them myself, but I'm told they can be very effective." Arthur blinked at him. "What an extraordinary person," he muttered to himself. "I beg your pardon," said the old man. "Oh, nothing, I'm sorry," said Arthur in embarrassment. "All right, where do we go?" "In my air car," said the old man, motioning Arthur to get into the craft which had settled silently next to them. "We're going deep into the bowels of the planet, where even now our race is being revived from its 5 million-year slumber. Magrathea awakes." Arthur shivered involuntarily as he seated himself next to the old man. The strangeness of it, the silent bobbing movement of the craft as it soared into the night sky, quite unsettled him. He looked at the old man, his face illuminated by the dull glow of tiny lights on the instrumental panel. "Excuse me," he said to him. "What is your name, by the way?" "My name?" said the old man, and the same distant sadness came into his face again. He paused. "My name," he said, "is Slarty Bartfast." Arthur practically choked. "I beg your pardon," he sputtered. "Slarty Bartfast," repeated the old man quietly. "Slarty Bartfast." The old man looked at him gravely. "I said it wasn't important," he said. The air car sailed through the night. Chapter 23. You know what? Actually, when I'm done with chapter 23, I'm going to go take a break. It is an important and popular fact that things are not always what they seem. For instance, on the planet Earth, man had always assumed that he was much more intelligent than dolphins because he had achieved so much. The wheel, New York, wars, and so on. While all the dolphins had ever done was muck about in the water having a good time. But conversely, the dolphins had always believed that they were far more intelligent than man, for precisely the same reasons. Curiously enough, the dolphins had long known of the impending destruction of the planet Earth and had made many attempts to alert mankind to the danger, but most of their communications were misinterpreted as amusing attempts to punch footballs or whistle for tidbits. So they eventually gave up and left the Earth by their own means shortly before the Vogons arrived. The last ever dolphin message was misinterpreted as a surprisingly sophisticated attempt to do a double backward somersault through a hoop while whistling the Star-Spangled Banner. But in fact, the message was this: "So long, and thanks for all the fish." In fact, there was only one species on the planet more intelligent than dolphins, and they spent a lot of their time in behavioral research laboratories running around inside wheels and conducting frighteningly elegant and subtle experiments on man. The fact that, once again, man completely misinterpreted this relationship was entirely according to these creatures' plans. Chapter 24. Alright, I'm going to go take a quick break. I will be back to read some books. Alright, I'm back. Oh, very nice. Alright, where were we? Chapter 24. Silently, the air car coasted through the cold darkness, a single soft glow of light that was utterly alone in the deep Magrathian night. It sped swiftly. Arthur's companion seemed sunk in his own thoughts, and when Arthur tried on a couple of occasions to engage him in conversation again, he would simply reply by asking if he was comfortable enough, and then left it at that. Arthur tried to gauge the speed at which they were traveling, but the blackness outside was absolute, and he was denied any reference points. The sense of motion was so soft and slight that he could almost believe that they were hardly moving at all. Then a tiny glow of light appeared in the far distance, and within seconds had grown so much in size that Arthur realized it was traveling toward them at a colossal speed. And they tried to make out what sort of craft it might be. He peered at it, but was unable to discern any clear shape, and suddenly gasped in alarm as the air car dipped sharply and headed downward in what seemed certain to be a collision course. Their relative velocity seemed unbelievable, and Arthur had hardly time to draw breath before it was all over. The next thing he was aware of was an insane silver blur that seemed to surround him. He twisted his head sharply around and saw a small black point dwindling rapidly in the distance behind them, and it took him several seconds to realize what had happened. They had plunged into a tunnel in the ground. The colossal speed had been their own relative to the glow of light, which was a stationary hole in the ground. At the mouth of the tunnel, the insane blur of silver was the circular wall of the tunnel down which they were shooting, apparently at several hundred miles an hour. He closed his eyes in terror. After a length of time which he made no attempt to judge, he sensed a slight subsidence in their speed, and some while later became aware that they were gradually gliding to a gentle halt. He opened his eyes again. They were still in the silver tunnel, threading and weaving their way through what appeared to be crisscross warren of converging tunnels. When they finally stopped, it was in a small chamber of curved steel. Several tunnels also had their termini here, and at the farther end of the chamber, Arthur could see a large circle of dim, irritating light. It was irritating because it played tricks with the eyes. It was impossible to focus on it properly, or tell how near or far it was. Arthur guessed quite wrongly that it might be ultraviolet. Slarty Bartfast turned around and regarded Arthur with his solemn old eyes. "Earthman," he said, "we are now deep in the heart of Magrathea." "How did you know I was an Earthman?" demanded Arthur. "These things will become clear to you," said the old man gently. "At least," he added with a slight doubt in his voice, "clearer than they are at the moment." He continued, "I should warn you that the chamber we are about to pass into does not literally exist within our planet. It is too large. We are about to pass through a gateway into a vast tract of hyperspace which may disturb you." Arthur made nervous noises. Slarty Bartfast touched a button and added, not entirely reassuringly, "It scares the willies out of me. Hold tight." The car shot forward straight into the circle of light, and suddenly Arthur had a fairly clear idea of what infinity looked like. It wasn't infinity, in fact. Infinity itself looks flat and uninteresting. Looking up into the night sky is looking into infinity. Distance is incomprehensible and therefore meaningless. The chamber into which the air car emerged was anything but infinite. It was just very, very, very big. So big that it gave the impression of infinity. Far better than infinity itself. Arthur's senses bobbed and spun as, traveling the immense speed he knew the air car attained, they climbed slowly through the open air, leaving the gateway through which they had passed an invisible pinprick in the shimmering wall behind them. The wall. The wall defied the imagination, seduced it, and defeated it. The wall was so paralyzingly vast and sheer that its top, bottom, and sides passed away beyond the reach of sight. The mere shock of vertigo could kill a man. The wall appeared perfectly flat. It would take the finest laser measuring equipment to detect that as it climbed apparently to infinity, as it dropped dizzily away, as it planned out to either side, it also curved. It met itself again 13 light seconds away. In other words, the wall formed the inside of a hollow sphere. A sphere over 3 million miles across and flooded with unimaginable light. Welcome, said Slarty Bartfast, as the tiny speck that was the air car, traveling now at 3 times the speed of sound, crept imperceptibly forward into the mind-boggling space. Welcome, he said, to our factory floor. Arthur stared about him in a kind of wonderful horror, ranged away before them, at distances he could neither judge nor even guess at, were a series of curious suspensions, delicate traceries of metal and light hung about shadowy spherical shapes that hung in the space. And this, said Slarty Bartfast, is where we make most of our planets, you see. You mean, said Arthur, trying to form the words, you mean you're starting it all up again now? No, good heavens, no, exclaimed the old man. No, the galaxy isn't nearly rich enough to support us yet. No, we've been awakened to perform just one extraordinary commission for very special clients from another dimension. It may interest you. They're in the distance in front of us. Arthur followed the old man's finger until he was able to pick out the floating structure that he was pointing at. It was indeed the only one of the many structures that betrayed any sign of activity about it. And though this was more a subliminal impression than anything one could put one's finger on. At that moment, however, a flash of light arced through the structure and revealed in stark relief the patterns that were formed on the dark sphere within. Patterns that Arthur knew, rough, blobby shapes that were as familiar to him as the shapes of words, part of the furniture of his mind. For a few seconds he sat in stunned silence as the images rushed around his mind and tried to find somewhere to settle down and make sense. Part of his brain told him that he knew perfectly well what he was looking at and what the shapes represented, while another quite sensibly refused to countenance the idea and abdicated responsibility for any further thinking in that direction. The flash came again, and this time there could be no doubt. The Earth, whispered Arthur. Well, the Earth Mark II in flat, said Slarty Bartfast cheerfully. We're making a copy from our original blueprints. There was a pause. Are you trying to tell me, said Arthur slowly and with control, that you originally made the Earth? Oh yes, said Slarty Bartfast. Did you ever go to a place, I think it was called Norway? No, said Arthur. No, I didn't. Pity, said Slarty Bartfast. That was one of mine. Won an award, you know. Lovely crinkly edges. I was most upset to hear of its destruction. You were upset? Yes, 5 minutes later it wouldn't have mattered so much. It was a quite shocking cock-up. Huh? Said Arthur. The mice were furious. The mice were furious? Oh yes, said the old man mildly. Yes, well, so I expected were the dogs and cats and duck-billed platypuses, but they hadn't paid for it, you see, had they? Look, said Arthur, would it save you a lot of time if I just gave up and went mad now? For a while the air car flew on in awkward silence. The old man tried patiently to explain. Earthman. The planet you lived on was commissioned, paid for, and run by mice. It was destroyed 5 minutes before the completion of the purpose for which it was built. And we've got to build another one. Only one word was registering with Arthur. Mice? He said, Indeed, Earthman. Look, sorry, are we talking about the little white furry things with the cheese fixation and women standing on tables screaming in early 60s sitcoms? Slarty Bartfast coughed politely. Earthman, he said, it is sometimes hard to follow your mode of speech. Remember, I've been asleep inside this planet of Magrathea for 5 million years, and know little of these early 60s sitcoms of which you speak. These creatures you call mice, you see, they are not quite as they appear. They are merely the protrusion into our dimension of vastly hyper-intelligent, pan-dimensional beings. The whole business with the cheese and the squeaking is just a front. And the old man paused with a sympathetic frown and continued, They've been experimenting on you, I'm afraid. Arthur thought about this for a second and then his face cleared. No. He said, I see the source of the misunderstanding now. Look, you see, what happened was that we used to do experiments on them. They were often used in behavioral research, Pavlov, and all that sort of stuff. So, what happened was that the mice would be set in all sorts of tests, learning to ring bells, run around mazes, and things so that the whole nature of the learning process could be examined. From our observation of their behavior, we were able to learn all sorts of things about our own. Arthur's voice trailed off. Such subtlety, said Slarty Bartfast. One has to admire it. What? Said Arthur. How better to disguise the real nature, and how better to guide your thinking. Suddenly, running down the maze the wrong way, eating the wrong bit of cheese unexpectedly, dropping dead of myxomatosis, if it's finally calculated, the cumulative effect is enormous. He paused for a moment. You see, Earthman, they really are particularly clever, hyper-intelligent, pan-dimensional beings. Your planet and people have formed the matrix of an organic computer running a 10 million year research program. Let me tell you the whole story. It'll take a little time. Time, said Arthur weakly, is not currently one of my problems. Chapter 25. There are, of course, many problems connected with life, of which some of the most popular are: why are people born? Why do they die? Why do they want to spend so much of the intervening time wearing digital watches? Many, many millions of years ago, a race of hyper-intelligent, pan-dimensional beings whose physical manifestation in their own pan-dimensional universe is not dissimilar to our own, got so fed up with the constant bickering about the meaning of life, which used to interrupt their favorite pastime of Brokian Ultra Cricket, a curious game which involved suddenly hitting people for no readily apparent reason and then running away, that they decided to sit down and solve their problems once and for all. And to this end, they built themselves a stupendous supercomputer, which was so amazingly intelligent that even before its databanks had been connected up, it had started from I think, therefore I am, and got as far as deducing the existence of rice pudding and income tax before anyone managed to turn it off. It was the size of a small city. Its main console was installed in a specifically designed executive office, mounted on an enormous executive desk of the finest ultra mahogany, topped with rich ultra red leather. The dark carpeting was discreetly sumptuous. Exotic pot plants and tastefully engraved prints of the principal computer programmers and their families were deployed liberally about the room, and stately windows looked upon a tree-lined public square. On the day of the great on-turning, 2 soberly dressed programmers with briefcases arrived there and were shown discreetly into the office. They were aware that this day they would represent their entire race in its greatest moment, but they conducted themselves calmly and quietly as they seated themselves deferentially before the desk, opened their briefcases, and took out their leather-bound notebooks. Their names were Lunkwill and Fook. For a few moments, they sat in respectful silence. Then, after exchanging a quiet glance with Fook, Lunkwill leaned forward and touched a small black panel. The subtlest of hums indicated that the massive computer was now in total active mode. After a pause, it spoke to them in a voice rich, resonant, and deep. It said, "What is this great task for which I, Deep Thought, the second greatest computer in the universe of time and space, have been called into existence?" Lunkwill and Fook glanced at each other in surprise. "Your task, O computer," began Fook. "No, wait a minute," This isn't right, said Lunk-Will, worried. We distinctly designed this computer to be the greatest one ever. We're not making do with second best, Deep thought. He addressed the computer. Are you not, as we designed you to be, the greatest, most powerful computer in all time? I describe myself as the second greatest, intoned Deep thought, and such I am. Another worried look passed between the two programmers. Lunk-Will cleared his throat. There must be some mistake, he said. Are you not a greater computer than the milliard gargantubrain at Maximegalon, which can count all the atoms in a star in a millisecond? The milliard gargantubrain, said Deep thought, with unconcealed attempt, a mere abacus. Mention it not. And are you not, said Fuchs, leaning anxiously forward, a greater analyst than the Googleplex star thinker in the seventh galaxy of light and ingenuity, which can calculate the trajectory of every single dust particle throughout a 5-week Dangrabad beta sand blizzard? A 5-week sand blizzard, said Deep thought, haughtily. You ask this of me, who have been contemplated the very vectors of the atoms in the Big Bang itself? Molest me not with this pocket calculator stuff. The two programmers sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment. Then Lunk-Will leaned forward again. But are you not, he said, a more fiendish disputant than the great hyperlogic omnicognate neutron wrangler Ciceronicus 12, the magic and indefatigable, the great hyperlogic omnicognate neutron wrangler, said Deep thought, thoroughly rolling the R's. Oh wait, hold on. The great hyperbolic omnicognate neutron wrangler. I can't do it. This is a Deep thought, thoroughly rolling the R's. Could talk all 4 legs off an Arcturian mega donkey. I can't do it. But only I could persuade it to go for a walk afterward. Then what, asked Fuchs, is the problem? There's no problem, said Deep thought with magnificent ringing tones. I am simply the second greatest computer in the universe of space and time. But the second, insisted Lunk-Will. Why do you keep saying the second? You're surely not thinking of the multicorticoid persicutron Titan molar, are you? Or the pondermatic, or the contemptuous lights flashed across the computer's console. I spare not a single unit of thought on these cybernetic simpletons, he boomed. I speak of none but the computer that is to come after me. Fuchs was losing patience. He pushed his notebook aside and muttered, I think this is getting needlessly messianic. You know nothing of future time, pronounced Deep thought, and yet in my teeming circuitry I can navigate the infinite delta streams of future probability, and see that there must one day come a computer whose merest operational parameters I am not worthy to calculate, but which it will be my fate to eventually design. Fuchs sighed heavily and glanced across to Lunk-Will. Can we get on and ask the question? He said. Lunk-Will motioned him to wait. What computer is this of which you speak? He asked. I will speak of it no further in this present time, said Deep thought. Now ask what else of me you will, that I may function. Speak. They shrugged at each other. Fuchs composed himself. O Deep thought computer, he said, the task we have designed you to perform is this. We want you to tell us. He paused. The answer. The answer, said Deep Thought. The answer to what? Life, urged Poop. The universe, said Lunkwill. Everything, they said in chorus. Deep Thought paused for a moment's reflection. Tricky, he said finally. But can you do it? Again, a significant pause. Yes, said Deep Thought. I can do it. There is an answer, said Fook with breathless excitement. A simple answer, added Lunkwill. Yes, said Deep Thought. Life, the universe, and everything. There is an answer, but, he added, I'll have to think about it. A sudden commotion destroyed the moment. The door flew open, and two angry men wearing the coarse faded blue robes and belts of the Cruiswan University burst into the room, thrusting aside the ineffectual flunky who tried to bar their way. We demand admission, shouted the younger of the two men, elbowing the pretty young secretary in the throat. Come on, shouted the older one. You can't keep us out. He pushed a junior programmer back through the door. We demand that you can't keep us out, bawled the younger one, though he was now firmly inside the room and no further attempts were being made to stop him. Who are you? Said Lunkwill, rising angrily from his seat. What do you want? I am the Magique Thieves, announced the older one. And I demand that I am Vroom Fondle, shouted the younger one. Magique Thieves turned on Vroom Fondle. It's all right, he explained angrily. You don't need to demand that. All right, bawled Vroom Fondle, banging on a nearby desk. I am Vroom Fondle, and that is not a demand. That is a solid fact. What we demand is solid facts. No, we don't, exclaimed Magic Thief in irritation. That is precisely what we don't demand. Scarcely pausing for a breath, Vroom Fondle shouted, We don't demand solid facts. What we demand is a total absence of solid facts. I demand that I may or may not be Vroom Fondle. But who the devil are you? Exclaimed an outraged Poop. We, said Magic Thief, are philosophers. Though we may not be, said Vroom Fondle, waving a warning finger at the programmers. Oh, though we may not be. Oh, I get it. Okay. Yes, we are, insisted Magic Thief. We are quite definitely here as representatives of the amalgamated union of philosophers, sages, luminaries, and other thinking persons. And we want this machine off, and we want it off now. What's the problem? Said Lunkwill. I'll tell you what the problem is, mate, said Magique Thief. Demarcation. That's the problem. We demand, yelled Vroom Fondle, that demarcation may or may not be the problem. You just let the machines get on with the adding up, warned Magique Thief, and we'll take care of the eternal verities. Thank you very much. You want to check your legal position, you do, mate. Under law, the quest for ultimate truth is quite clearly the inalienable prerogative of your working thinkers. Any bloody machine goes and actually finds it, and we're straight out of a job, aren't we? I mean, what's the use of our sitting up half the night arguing that there may or may not be a God if this machine only goes and gives you his bleeding phone number the next morning? That's right, shouted Vroom Fondle. We demand rigidly defined areas of doubt and uncertainty. Suddenly, a stentorian voice boomed across the room. Might I make an observation at this point? Inquired Deep Thought. We'll go on strike, yelled Vroom Fondle. That's right, agreed Magique Thief. You will have a national philosopher's strike on your hand. The hum level in the room suddenly increased as several ancillary bass driver units mounted in sedately carved and varnished cabinet speakers around the room cut in to give Deep Thought's voice a little more power. All I want to say, bellowed the computer, is that my circuits are now irrevocably committed to calculating the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. He paused and satisfied himself that he now had everyone's attention before continuing more quietly. But the program will take me a little while to run. Fook glanced impatiently at his watch. How long? 7.5 million years, said Deep Thought. Lungwell and Fook blinked at each other. 7.5 million years, they cried in chorus. Yes, declaimed Deep Thought. I said I'd have to think about it, didn't I? And it occurs to me that running a program like this is bound to create an enormous amount of popular publicity for the whole area of philosophy in general. Everyone's going to have their own theories about what answer I'm eventually going to come up with. And who better to capitalize on that media market than you yourselves? So long as you can keep disagreeing with each other violently enough and maligning each other in the popular press, and so long as you have clever agents, you can keep yourself on the gravy train for life. How does that sound?